Adrian, thank you for joining me. I'm excited to have you here in the office.
I know, it's been a while since I've been in here. I do kind of miss it, but I don't miss the traffic.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. I complain every single morning as I drive in here. But it's good to have you in here.
Yeah.
So I think what we can do, we can start first with introductions and talk about who we are and what we intend to do here. It's kind of funny, the timing on this presentation that we're putting together.
I promise we scheduled this weeks before
Right.
the events
Yes.
of last week.
Yes. Our marketing team has been spamming you for weeks about a DR
Yeah.
presentation. It just happened to be in the week of the largest IT failure in the history of the world.
Yeah, so far.
So far. Yes, caveat that, so far, yes. So my name is Rohana Mead. Please call me Ro. I am the CEO of Synergy Technical. I am what I refer to as a recovering CIO. I spent many years as a CIO before founding Synergy Technical. So I kind of wear two hats. I tend to look at things, and my staff will tell you, from the CIO perspective, but then the other side of it is that I also look at it from the CEO and the business leader perspective. So, and this is Adrian.
Hi, I've been doing webinars for Synergy for years and years. Pre-sales engineer and actually a long history of both private and government on-premises IT support for years before that. So I kind of came to the cloud in its early days, and I've been here for the whole journey.
Yes.
And it's been really exciting. And actually, it's really interesting. This is the first time I've ever sat in this seat. When we've done interview events in the past, and I've done it. I've always sat on that side. So this is kind of weird.
Yeah.
The orientation is a little bit different. I feel like I'm up for my performance review.
Yeah. We could use it.
Oh, yikes. All right, we're going to find out.
Just kidding. All right, so most of you will know who Synergy is, but I think we can tell you a little bit about us. So we were founded in 2011. That means we're coming around on
13?
13 years. Yeah, my math is bad.
It's all right.
We were born as a cloud partner. We focused primarily on cloud technologies in the beginning. We do a whole heck of a lot more than that now. At this point, we have deployed about 3 million users to the cloud. I think it's actually a lot more than that.
So,
we stopped counting at 3 million. And we have customers.
Billions served, right?
Billions served, that's right. Well, we should totally get the sign. That would be fun. At this point, we have customers in all 50 states, and we have done project work in over 70 countries. And again, we stopped counting at that number. It could be a higher number now at this point. But so that's who we are. What we wanted to talk about today was disaster recovery. Again, incredible timing, but we wanted to talk about disaster recovery and the strategies that you can use in order to protect your IT landscape. So with that, I'm going to ask Adrian a bunch of questions.
Oh boy.
Yeah. Some might just come off the top of my head, and you may not be prepared for them, but you know what? You can roll with bunches.
I'll do my best.
Fast as anybody can. So I'm going to start with a super obvious question, but actually we get asked this all the time because we do implement cloud technologies. Do I really need a disaster recovery plan?
Well, that depends on whether or not you want your business to survive your disaster.
Okay.
So, I mean, I love to lean in with the "it depends" first, right? Because that's the classic IT answer. Yes, obviously, if you have things that you care about, you plan on ways to protect them, and you also plan on ways to get them back after any sort of thing has gone wrong, whether it's IT resources or physical devices that you care about, heirlooms in your family, right? You've always got some sort of plan in place to make sure that they are protected and that you have some way to either get them back or find some way to be compensated in the event of their total loss, right? So yes, if you care about your business, if you care about the things that you do, you need to have some plan in place to recover.
Yeah, and I think that, putting my old CIO hat on, I think that what people forget about with DR plans are, there's different levels of disasters. And there is the disaster that occurs because of a hurricane or a tornado,
Sure.
or in your entire data center or whatever, building, whatever is wiped out. There are disasters that are caused because of maybe, virus attacks or things like that, where while your IT estate is functioning and running, maybe some portion of it is not available, and it's a business critical component of that. There are disasters that occur because of human errors. I would categorize this week is
Yeah.
falling into that. Some human being didn't follow the testing that they should have and took out the world, basically.
And this isn't actually even the first time that we've had to deal with human error causing wide-scale outages. I don't know if you recall the S3 outage from a few years ago that took out most of the East Coast Amazon storage.
Yeah. So there are a whole bunch of things that can cause IT disasters, and
Sure.
so disaster isn't necessarily a hurricane. The other thing that I really like to make sure that people understand, and again, I'm going to put my former CIO hat on, you need to account for people. And that's not people making mistakes. That's, maybe you have a server admin or, some sort of IT administrator that is the only one that knows how to restore your systems. And so when that hurricane happens or that tornado happens and half the town is taken out, are you really going to be the one to say, no, you can't deal with this incredibly difficult personal situation where your house has been wiped out? You need to come in and you need to start restoring servers. And I think that people forget that you have to plan for those things too.
So, interesting little story on that. Years ago, I was going through a very serious family crisis. And it just so happened that when I traveled in support of one of those crisis scenarios, there was a ransomware attack on the company that I was working for at the time. And credit to their senior management, nobody contacted me at all, except for one question about where to get a recovery key. That was it. Beyond that, I was left to deal with that crisis, and I actually have always really appreciated that.
Right. But these are the types of things that we want to make sure that you're planning for, because no one wants to be on the front page for a ransomware attack, but also no one wants to not be able to recover from that and have to pay the ransom, and that does happen.
Yes.
More than you would think that happens. So let's talk about 2023 for a minute. And when I put these stats together, it was, again, prior to the craziness that's happened this week. In 2023, in the U.S., so here, there were 23 $1 billion natural disasters, meaning that there were 23 independent events that created $1 billion in damage. So when we're talking about planning for DR, it's not an if, it's a when.
Right, yeah.
It's when it's going to happen and when you need to execute that DR plan. The other thing that's super interesting is this stat. In 2023, the average cost of a data breach reached $4.45 million, with 83% of organizations experiencing more than one breach. So again, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. Something, you can have all the controls in place in the world. Something at some point is going to happen, and you're going to have that data breach, and you're going to need to figure out how to recover from it. Downtime costs are super interesting. So businesses reported an average loss of $300,000 per hour of downtime cost due to IT disruptions. Again, nobody's put a number around.
Yeah, we're waiting on that one, aren't we?
Yeah, I just can't even begin to imagine. When you look at it, I can't begin to imagine what the cost is around that. The other really sad statistic is that if you're a small business, and so that's probably a business that has less than 500 employees, which is some of those are very viable businesses.
Yeah, absolutely.
Approximately 60% of small businesses affected by a major disaster have closed within 6 months because they just can't afford that downtime and they didn't have a plan to recover. So those are really sobering statistics. And again, I don't have 2024 data. I think when we look back at 2024, it's going to be a crazy town.
It is. And one thing I think is really interesting about the numbers affecting smaller businesses is that generally they are the preferred targets when we're talking about attack vectors and not so much, like a hurricane came through or anything or even a misconfiguration, but generally speaking, when attackers are looking for a foothold into a very large organization, they're using smaller organizations to do it. So
Sure.
it has always been a critical spot for me, and I've always been really passionate about security for small businesses. DR is great, but you know where I come from.
I do. You're a security geek through
I'm
and
a
through.
security geek through and through.
Yes, he is. So we're in the cloud space. Doesn't mean we don't do on-prem work, because we do. And on-prem can be work on servers that live in the cloud also.
Sure.
I think that
Sure.
we need to make that distinction. And we have a lot of customers that have Office 365. So they use services like Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, OneDrive for Business. We get asked all the time, if I have those services, do I need to back up those services, and do I really need DR?
Yeah.
That's my question
So,
for you.
And actually, I've watched this space grow dramatically over the last several years, right? The answer up until about 2021, maybe 2022, was, well, Microsoft doesn't offer a backup solution for Office 365. So if you want to do a backup, you're looking at a third-party solution. And I used to attend a lot of conferences where I would walk by people with, fancy shirts and beautiful signs behind them that said, like, hey, are you backing up your Office 365? And their take was, what are you going to do when the cloud goes down? And my response was, well, what are you going to do when the cloud goes down? Because where are you going to restore my stuff to? But there have been some pretty significant advances with the capabilities around both individual backup capabilities and restore capabilities, but also administrator-driven controls. And that's where we start looking into, like, okay, I need to do a large amount of backup and a large amount of recovery on users' behalfs. I can't task my users with recovering from their own disasters, right? On an individual level, oops, I dropped my laptop, sure. But at a corporate scale of, I have thousands of Windows PCs that won't start today, right? Then you need to have some sort of way to orchestrate the data recovery. And absolutely, yes, there are really profound capabilities that are opened up when you start looking beyond the built-in things like litigation holds and things like that people have used to sort of cobble together backup solutions for Office 365 in the past. There's, like I said, really great orchestration capabilities and really centralized controls, so that when management needs to observe the state of a disaster recovery process, we now actually can exercise those controls and observe those states and see what is our RPO, what is our RTO, how far are we down the path of completing this recovery. So I think, yes, absolutely, this conversation couldn't have even happened 4 or 5 years ago.
Right.
But I think it's fantastic, and it's a really powerful control that admins should absolutely be able to take advantage of.
Well, and some of the things that we see, so we have a managed services business, as you know, and so we've got support desk people that help users all day long, every day. Some of the things that we see are, we have clients that they've moved file servers into SharePoint Online. That's a pretty common scenario that we see. And users can have permissions to delete files because, they're managing the files. So what happens when a user who has permissions to the finance SharePoint site where all the finance files are stored, maybe deletes that folder and no one notices for 35 days because it happened right after month end, and we run into these month end cycles, and now we're beyond the retention windows. And that's the kind of stuff that we see where I think backing up at least components of Office 365 makes sense.
Absolutely. And there's some really, so I mentioned it's very granular, very robust. It's in the Microsoft 365 backup tool set, right, which is actually a component of SharePoint Premium. But it actually allows you to be extremely granular to a point in time, but also you can restore to an altered location. So you don't actually have to restore it into its original directory tree. If you want to restore it somewhere else and make sure that data is the version that you're looking for, maybe that appears to have been deleted, but there's some sort of a database corruption error, and what you're actually restoring is somehow worse, right? You can actually do those comparisons and make sure that you're getting the right data from the right timeline.
Or maybe I have a ransomware attack and all of my files, while they are there in SharePoint Online or in OneDrive, are now encrypted and I can't get to them.
Yeah. And again, you're talking about I view this as a difference between looking at an individual user's challenge and an organizational or even a business unit challenge, right? If it's an individual user who clicked the email, they're not necessarily connected to a bunch of other users. They got ransomed and they called the help desk and they said, what do I do, right? That user actually can go back into their own OneDrive history and restore any point in time over the past 3 weeks. So like there are some really great native data resiliency capabilities, but the second that starts to take down the department, that's when the admin is going to say, okay, let's put a pause on this and I'll start looking at processes.
Right. So Microsoft 365 backup, as I understand it, can back up OneDrive for Business,
Yes.
SharePoint Online,
Mm-hmm.
Exchange Online,
Yes.
and Teams maybe? Or is
Well, Teams as a function of the presentation layer of all of those other applications.
Okay. So it's an interesting tool set that is fairly new.
It is. I think it's actually technically still in premium, or sorry, in preview.
Okay. But something important to understand.
Absolutely.
All right, we're going to pivot a little bit to Azure and the solutions that are available in Azure. So can we talk about what the DR capabilities that exist in Azure? Because obviously we have a huge Azure business.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, I want to start with the native data resiliency capabilities that begin in Azure, right? And then we'll layer on because they actually all kind of build up to be a whole solution, right? So within Azure itself, you're going to choose the resiliency of your data, right? That's a choice you make when you instantiate storage. You're deciding, is this locally redundant or is it zone redundant? Is it geo redundant? Right? You have all these choices. Even at the lowest level, at just locally redundant storage, you get 3 copies of your data synchronously written across 3 different racks, not just 3 different servers in the same rack, but 3 physically separate racks. So if a fire breaks out on one side of the data center, you're not going to lose your data. The crazy thing is, how many 9s did you used to drive toward as a CIO of recoverability or data availability?
Usually 4.
Okay, 4 was good, 5 was like, man,
Yeah.
you had some serious redundancy. At the locally redundant storage level, I would just verify these numbers this morning. We're talking 11 9s,
Oh, wow.
right?
Okay.
The second you start layering in redundancy across geographies or even across availability zones, you add an additional 12th 9 to that. Then when you start scaling that out to things like read-only geo-redundant storage, where you have synchronous write locally, asynchronous write across data connections, then you have synchronous writes in other places, and you can read some of it. They're saying 16 9s, right? I mean, these are real numbers that are being out there around the data resiliency of your storage itself, and that's going to underpin so much of what else we do. But then you got to start talking about, okay, well, it's not just storage that I'm looking to back up. I'm looking to back up systems, right? Systems that communicate with each other. And in that case, we're going to start layering in Azure Site Recovery Services, right? So ASR. So Azure Site Recovery allows you to basically identify a whole bunch of systems that work together, whether they are servers in your environment. You can include SQL Always On as part of an ASR data set. It's going to have an agent that's going to orchestrate things, and it's going to write it to a place in Azure, and then you can actually test failover and fail back so that you can actually build up your entire Azure infrastructure to run your data set, right, your application, whatever it looks like, and then actually fail it back. And so you can capture all the VMs, all the databases, all the whatevers that make up part of your service.
So going back a few years in nomenclature, would that be similar to what I would have considered a hot site in?
I would call it that, actually, but the way that it works, so you can really orchestrate it to control your costs very carefully, right? So I would think of a hot site as your servers are actually always on and always replicating. So you, in Exchange terms, you might think of it as like a DAG where there's disk running on both ends. It's copying a database in real time. For the SQL side, that may be true, but for the servers, they're usually parked, and you're writing data deltas to those VMDKs, I can't remember what the term is, but you're writing data deltas to those, and you spin them up, and they should look like your, again, going back to the RPO, RTO, recovery point objective and recovery time objective, they should look like the most recent RPO objective when you turn them on. But then you're only paying for the compute while the systems are on, so it's not a hot site unless you just leave them running.
Okay, okay, okay. So that's ASR. What about Azure Backup?
So they kind of work part and parcel together, right? And I talk about the native data resiliency capabilities of the storage itself. But that's only for storage that is already living in Azure. So if you have storage on servers or on premises, maybe your RPO for your system is an hour, but your RPO for the data that is resident on it can only be out by 10 minutes or something along those
Okay.
lines, right? So Azure Backup is actually looking at the data you have stored in your systems. It could be file data, it could be a disk mounted to an application of some sort, but you are now backing up that data to Azure storage.
Okay, okay. So I could have an on-prem server that I am backing up to Azure storage rather than having what would historically be, again, some sort of, we're not in the days of tape anymore, but maybe a disk-to-disk
Sure,
backup
yeah.
or something like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, actually, yeah, and that's exactly my favorite scenario for Azure Backup, because by putting it in Azure Backup, so let's go back to the tape days, right? So my
Okay.
very first actual corporate IT job was loading tapes into a machine and handling these are the daily tapes, these are the weekly tapes, these are the monthly tapes, this is the cleaning tape, right? I haven't thought about a cleaning tape in years.
Wow,
Right? But we replaced those with JBODs at the first tier, right? Just a bunch of disks, right? So you would commit your early writes to that, then you would carve off the weeklies to the tape and all that fun stuff. Azure Backup works so much like a JBOD that it's hard to kind of abstract yourself from that thought. But the difference is, if you are using something like on-site storage, mapped storage, mounted storage, whatever, as part of your backup solution, and the bad guys get a hold of that, they just ransom that, right?
Okay.
So now your backups are meaningless because you can't restore them. But if it's using something like Azure Backup, where it's not visible to the operating system that's performing the backup, it's not available on the network through some sort of like a net backup interface or any of that kind of stuff, it's orchestrated, it's replicated, it's protected, it's encrypted at rest, it's encrypted in transit, it's not available to be attacked.
Okay.
Yeah, so all of that kind of stuff, all the tape rotations that we think, oh, that's old, there's still a lot of organizations that are writing to disk and then committing that disk to somewhere else. And that is still a vulnerability in the backup of data.
I haven't thought about any of this in so many years.
I
It's
know,
wild.
yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about then geo-redundant storage.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Okay, so I touched on this a little bit in terms of data resiliency, right? In that if you're inside of if you do locally redundant storage, you get those 11 nines, right? Geo-redundant storage, and there's a slightly lower tier of that called or maybe it's higher tier. Anyway, there's another tier of geo-redundant storage that's called GZRS, where you're choosing Azure availability zones as your
Okay.
right domains. But essentially, what you're doing is you're taking all of those distributed synchronous copies of commit of your Azure data in storage, and you're moving it to different actual data centers or different Azure availability zones. And those geographies are all going to honor your geopolitical boundaries too, right? So there's a couple of data centers that can't write to an additional data center because there's only one data center in that country. But if you have Australian data, you're always going to write to an Australian partner. If you have US data, you're always going to write to a US partner. I think the only place in the entire planet that writes outside of a geopolitical boundary is Brazil, because when they stood up the first Brazil data center, its replication partner was a US central. But that's changing. If you look at the documentation, they show that that's changing right now.
Didn't know that even existed.
Yeah,
So
there you go.
There you go. There you go. All right, so when we look at the backup solutions that are available in Azure, really what we've got is ASR, which is replicating workloads from one place to another.
And it doesn't even have to be on-prem. You can be pulling things from AWS, you can be pulling things,
Okay.
yeah, and it doesn't matter where you want to restore them to. Microsoft would prefer that you restore that content into Azure, but you can restore it back to on-prem, you can restore it to AWS, you can restore it to physical or virtual machines, however you want to build that out.
Okay, so ASR is from place to place, and those places can be on-prem, in the cloud, we
Yeah.
don't care. Azure backup is from server to Azure.
Azure storage.
Right there. Geo-redundant storage is replicating your data to a different region
Yep.
within the same geopolitical boundary. I'm making sure I understand this
Yes,
correctly.
absolutely, yeah.
And then Azure availability zones are really physically separate locations within the same data center or within the same Azure.
So they
region?
can be within the same data center, or they can be within the same geopolitical boundary.
Okay. Those are the components that we have
Yes.
available to us in Azure. All right, so let's pretend for a minute that I am building out a disaster recovery plan, and I have some confusion between ASR and Azure backup. Which tool would I use when?
So I tend to think of it as what is your desired end state, right? If you're building out a true DR scenario, you think, okay, I got to get everything that's in the data center, right? And I'm not planning on migrating any workloads into cloud native workloads. I just want to take my application and I want to plunk it down over here. You have a decision to make with that with regard to how much churn do you have in the data versus how much churn do you have in the system. Okay, if it's a relatively stable system, like 5 or 6 servers that are all talking together, you're not writing a lot of data except maybe into a SQL database. That's going to be a solid Azure site recovery discussion, right?
Okay.
Because you're looking at just taking VMs and moving them and sticking them over here. Okay.
Okay.
Now, when you
So
have
point A goes down, fire up point B.
exactly, and
Got it.
again, you can test these things without any sort of service disruptions. I mean, some of the test failover capabilities are fantastic. And incidentally, I know we didn't really cover this, it's not really part of a disaster recovery specific scenario, but you can actually use ASR for free for 31 days if you use it as a migration tool to move those servers
Seen that
into
many
Azure,
times.
right? Yeah.
Many times.
But if you have a system with a complex and high churn data volume, if you will, that for me is going to be a much more native play for Azure backup, because I'm looking at backing up the data that's on that server. I may choose to restore that data to a cloned VM that I've stood up as part of ASR,
Okay.
because it's going to be the same machine, right? But it's going to be more for high churn data.
Okay. In my brain, a feeble little brain that I have, ASR for me is I've got point A, I want to replicate to point B, I want point B to sit there, and if point A goes down, I want to automatically bring up point B.
Mm-hmm.
Azure backup for me feels a bit more like traditional backup.
Absolutely.
Where I want to back up a file server, I want to back up a SQL database, or I want to back up something, and I want to be able to restore incremental pieces of
Mhm.
that. So maybe some files within the file server, or some application. So it feels like they can go together, but for the most part, they tend to be independent.
They tend to be independent. I have seen several initiatives where both are brought to bear for the same task, but again, you're talking about, like you mentioned,
Right.
the whole system's got to come up, and then I gotta rehydrate a bunch of data. So like that can be a both tool
Yeah.
scenario.
With ASR, you can actually create automatic failovers.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes, yes, you can.
So it's more about high availability.
Absolutely.
Solution,
Yeah.
For sure. I'm glad you're smart about this, because I am not. Let me put it that way. Would you like to take some time and walk through kind of what an ASR solution could look like?
Not really.
Not really?
Sure.
Okay.
So the neat thing about ASR is that one of the native tools that Microsoft offers for you to get started with ASR is actually it's a pre-planning tool that will assess your machines that you plan to include in your ASR deployment for their viability, for how much memory and processor and disk they're using. It'll help size the VMs in Azure appropriately.
Okay.
Yeah, you can want to pause on this one, but there used to also be a capability to assess the actual traffic flows between the machines to make sure that you got the NSGs right in your Azure firewall rules, but I don't know if that's still there.
Okay.
So again, the planning tool helps you identify, right, make sure you got the right VM sizes, that you got the right disk available, that you have the right throughput for your machines, and that you're able to capture your entire system the way that you intend it to work in the cloud. I will say that there are some bolt-on considerations if you're going to look at ASR. Like if you're looking at replicating a system that relies heavily on Active Directory, I wouldn't wait until the failover to bring up a domain controller in Azure. I'd have that domain controller there. I would have my my sites and subnets predefined to make sure that authentication happens where I expect it to, because that's one of the biggest challenges you get into. You suddenly have a new subnet in your Active Directory. None of the machines in that subnet know where to authenticate, and suddenly you can have really long login times. So building out a little bit of infrastructure first to make sure that everything's going to be ready is going to go a long way.
Okay. What have we missed? What haven't we talked about?
Business continuity.
Okay.
Honestly, that to me became the biggest focus of the past week, right? And suddenly you have 4.5 million Windows PCs that can't boot. How do you do your business? Even if your systems are available on the back end, your database is unaffected, your Microsoft 365 is still available. What's your plan? How do you work through that? And I think that is something that we touched on it lightly with not contacting an admin who's going through a crisis, or who's unavailable for whatever reason. But there has to also be a way to make sure that if the business systems are up and available, that they can be leveraged. And this is where I think the natural temptation is to say, well, I can check my email on my phone. But we know that's not always the best experience for users, right? It's fairly unreasonable to ask that as a long-term strategy. But I did actually do some testing in Windows 365, and I did. I wanted to make sure that I was rock solid on this, but my Windows 365 provisioning policies and my user settings ensure that I'm capturing restore points. By default, I went with the every 12 hours, but you can run that down to every 4 hours, and we know roughly the timeline of when the channel file was released last week. You could simply restore your machines to the moment before that. Now that does raise the question, what are they using to get to Windows 365? But I can access that through Chrome books if I want to, right? And my kid has an old Chromebook sitting around that I could borrow for a day. So there's a lot of different ways that I could then be able to get access to my data and keep going. You remember I did the Windows 365 from my phone in a docking station and used it on a PC with a keyboard, or used it as a PC with a keyboard and a mouse for a whole day, and it worked really well.
I have traveled with an iPad and accessed Windows 365 with no issues. The nice thing with Windows 365 is you can roll back. So you can say, okay, if this is corrupted, let me go to a previous version.
Yeah.
So certainly from an endpoint perspective, I think that's a really, really great answer.
Yeah.
What else have we missed? Anything major?
I'm sure we've missed a lot. While we may not get too many comments on what we missed in the webinar itself, I'm sure that YouTube will light us up after the fact.
I have no doubt that that's true. Awesome. Well, I appreciate you coming in.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's great to be on this side of the setup for once.
Yeah, and so if you would like us to help you determine which tools would make sense for you or help you configure those tools, we are certainly available to do so. We've got a whole team of engineers that will sit down and they'll work with you and figure out, they'll help you write the entire disaster recovery plan if that's what you need. If you know what you need and you need help configuring, we can do that also. So thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
All right. Bye.